All right, pushing forward with our masking of local edits in Lightroom, we are going to now start covering these newer tools down here, color range and luminance range. So we've covered, just to recap, brush, linear, radial, how to use those in combination, and now we're going to talk about color range and luminance range. You will notice that depth range is grayed out most of the time. I will talk about that at the end of this video, and where it will become more useful. So color range, the way that color range works, if I select that, we see that my cursor turns into a little bit of an eyedropper, and you are going to select a color range based on areas of your photo that you click and drag on. So let's say that I want to edit just the sky of this photo. I'm going to click and drag and see what it selects. Boom, right there, it selected a pretty good color range. Remember, we can always change the overlays to get a better view of what our selection is. So, by all means, click through those and find the ones that work the best for you. I kind of think sometimes white on black, or sometimes color on, or image on black sometimes works best, or image on white. But it's totally up to you just to see, right? That's a pretty good selection right there. Now, for those of you that have messed around with Photoshop or will continue on with your photo education, you can dive into, in doing layer masks in Photoshop is a lot more advanced than it is in Lightroom, and there's a lot more editing that you can do and selecting more powers of selection in Photoshop. Not to discredit anything about Lightroom, because this is pretty amazing what you can do with just a couple clicks. So I'm going to go back to color overlay. So I have selected my sky. So now if I wanted to go and edit the sky, I could unclick the show overlay. I could bring the exposure of the sky down, get up. I could also change the hue or the saturation of the sky if for some reason you wanted to make really unrealistic-ish photos. That's totally fine right there. Right? You could make a red sky that's super saturated, something like that. That looks pretty good to me. I'm going to delete this mask really quick. And remember, you always can add or subtract these using a brush, right? So I could go add with my brush. And down here, it didn't select as well. So I could just, add a little brush in there, and it's going to select that area a little bit better. So I'm going to delete this mask because that's actually, I want to go a little bit deeper than that. So we're going to go back to the beginning here to no mask, and I am going to do the same thing. I'm going to select color range. So now let's say that we want to make a little bit more of an advanced selection than just the sky, right? So first thing we're going to do is we're going to select the sky. It's going to make a pretty similar selection to what we just made. Okay, there it is right there. But let's say that we want to go in and edit, we want to add some more color into that color range. I'm going to hold down the shift button, and that's going to add, and I can start clicking through my picture and start adding more to it. So let me actually just select this overlay to give you an idea of what we're doing here. So you're making a really detailed selection. So now not only are you selecting the sky, but you're also starting to select some of this orange in the landscape. Let's select something back here. So now we have the sky, the orange of the landscape right here, and the kind of like neutral color back here. And you can click through and select as many of those colors. Oh, actually, you know what? Sorry, you can't do as many as you want. I think you can select up to 5 different color points to edit all at once. So that makes a pretty advanced selection right there. So I'm just going to turn that off. I mean, we look at our mask. That's a really detailed layer mask right there. So if I just take that and let's say I just bump the shadows down, let's see what it does. Right, it's doing a really good job of blending it, and it's not, just selecting the sky becomes a pretty chunky selection. But doing something like this, where you're taking the color, selection, and kind of spreading it through multiple colors, it really is a way to really enhance the selection that you're doing. Let's actually go to another picture and see if we can kind of illustrate that a little better. That photo that I was working on here, sorry, this one is pretty limited in the color range because it's pretty much blue and orangey red. So let's go back to this picture here. This has a little bit more of a color range to it. So I'm gonna go create a new mask. I'm gonna go color range, and let's pick this green right here. So I'm gonna click and drag. Okay, it selected the green. I'm going to change the overlay because it's hard to see like that. So it selected that. I'm going to grab this yellow here of this mural, and that looks actually pretty good to me. Look how advanced that mask is right there. That's pretty dang good with 2 points. And then I could go turn off the overlay and just change the exposure of just those specific parts of the photo. That's a pretty useful tool. Remember, you can always go in and subtract with the brush. Let's say we want to get right all of those oranges and yellows in the background, but not so much on my wife. So we're just going to go and block those out really quick. Look how advanced that mask is. I mean, it's really just everything in the background that has yellow and green in it, and it's leaving the blue and the kind of neutral of the sidewalk, the blue of the sky and the neutral of the sidewalk alone. So that's a really useful tool, is using the color range to make selections of specific colors in your images. Let's go back to this photo right here, and then using it in collaboration with the brush is always a great way to do it. So I'm going to just delete all masks. So we're back to square one. And now I'm going to show you the luminance range. So when we're talking about the color range, we're talking about similar colors. When we're talking about luminance, we're talking about the same levels of brightness in the image. So if I grab the luminance mask, the way the luminance mask works is, let me actually make sure I have the right one selected. Yep, we're going to click, let's say the luminance of the sky is a lot brighter than the luminance of the landscape, right? So the way that I think about luminance is often tied to the idea of opacity. Something that's more transparent, that appears more transparent in a photograph, has a lot of luminance. Things that seem opaque in a photograph, like this rock for instance, have less luminance. So the sky doesn't feel, we usually don't, in our photos, we usually don't want the sky to appear as like a solid thing. We want it to seem airy. We want it to see something that's like transparent, that we're seeing through. So it has more luminance than down in this rock. So let me just click on the sky here, and it's going to make a luminance mask of everything within a range of the luminance of the sky that I clicked on. So when we do that, we see, if I change this selection, we see that it selected the sky and some of this stuff down here, because it's also pretty bright, right? But not much of the rock, not much of the shadows back in those areas. Now, if we wanted to edit the luminance range, we can go here and it's all plotted out, right? So we can make it a less of a range, right? So now this is just the mask up there, or I'm sorry, just in here is the mask, just where it's blue. Or we can make it a larger selection. We can bring it down here. So I'm just selecting more or less by editing the size of this luminance mask, right? Just by default, it does a pretty large, I think it did, maybe half of this luminance range right here. Let's hit this button 2 down here, show luminance map. This is often very helpful, right? So it's showing us where the mask is. Let's actually just go and unclick this. I get a little bit sideways with this. Unclick that. If we change the exposure, you're going to see where the mask is, right? That's where the mask is, right there. Remember that you can always use it to make a selection and then use the brush to go in and clean it up. Where the luminance mask is going to be really useful is if you wanted to or if say in an image you had water, like still water and a sky. Both of those things are going to have high amounts of luminance. So with one click, you could probably select the sky and the water, okay? And then edit it using the show luminance map and kind of dragging these sliders around until just what you want is selected. Remember, let's say that we had an image of the water and sky with a landscape. If we hit invert, it would then change everything except for that. Kind of like what I did with the linear gradient filter, where I did the sky and then inverted it again and did the landscape. Now with that said, the downside of the luminance range edit is it ends up being really pretty chunky. You really have to diffuse it quite a bit to make it useful, right? If you're pushing for the right side over, you notice that you're going to start getting these hard edges on your edit. We don't want hard edges. We want nice soft edges. But what we don't want is we don't want these like hard edges where we're going to see the pixelated difference between your selection and not your selection. So with that said, to be honest with you, I haven't found like this is going to be the most useful time to use the luminance range. I've mentioned this in previous videos. 90% of the time I'm using the brush tool, but I want you to know how to use it. These tools, kind of the thing about Adobe is they launch these tools and then they develop them further and further and further. So tools that were, luminance range has been around Lightroom for, I don't know, a couple years, but it's only kind of getting usable right now. And with that said, it's not necessarily something that I use in my own practice if I was editing photos in Lightroom, but it might be a way to make a selection really quick, depending on what you're editing. It just hasn't been that way for me, right? So just, with a brush and a color range, I could kind of do this same type of thing. But, if you look up in this mask, we did a pretty good job of selecting high luminance to like medium luminance in this selection while leaving the shadows alone, right? So if I wanted to, let's say, bring up the highlights, bring up the whites, and have these like really dark shadows, that's a way that I could do it, because this mask is leaving the shadows alone and just looking at the midtones and the highlights. So not a bad tool to know, but maybe not the masking tool you're going to use the most. So let's go back to create a new mask, and let's talk about depth range. So depth range is going to work similar to color range or luminance range, but most of the time you are going to see that it is grayed out as it is right here. Because as of right now, this tool, I believe this is true, only works on Apple photos that are made with an Apple camera, an iPhone, on portrait mode, or are saved as, I think they're called HEIC files. That's an Apple extension, and the way that you can use it is you can click on an area of focus and select everything on that level, right? So we're talking about distance from the camera, right? So if you use your iPhone on portrait mode, you take a picture of somebody, they're in focus, the background is out of focus. That's shallow depth of field, as we know. You could select the person in one click because they're relatively on the same plane of focus. Everything else is not. That's where depth range works. But like I said, I think it only works with iPhones right now. I don't know of any other camera that it works with. I don't think I've ever opened this up and clicked on depth range. And to be honest with you, to go even further, I don't want to go too much on a sidetrack here, but right, the shallow depth of field of those iPhone photos on portrait mode are actually fake. It's not a real, like when you all shoot your cameras wide open with your lens wide open to create a shallow depth of field photo, that's happening optically. In an iPhone, it's actually happening using masking, right? If you zoom in on one of those portrait mode photos on a cell phone, you're going to see a hard line delineation between focus and out of focus. That's not how shallow depth of field works. It's usually a feathered effect from focus to out of focus. So with that said, that's a long way of saying that depth range is only going to be useful for that right now, but I just kind of wanted to show you that it is there. All right, in the further videos, we are going to talk about select subject and select sky. I'll talk to you then.